Now, in a moment, as Big Ben strikes 10, we'll be able to give the result of our exit poll. For the first time, not an opinion poll, not people saying how they intend to vote, but people answering the question after they've voted. How did you vote? And that's how this is formed. We went to 130 different polling places to find this out. But remember, this is only an exit poll. If it was dead accurate, there'd be no need for anybody to go and vote. 10 o'clock. And this is what we're saying. It's going to be a hung parliament with the Conservatives as the largest party.
With the outcome of the general election, we find ourselves in a position unknown to this generation of political leaders, with no single party able to have a Commons majority and therefore have a majority government.
But however much pride we can take in that enormous advance, we have to accept that we fell short of an overall majority.
The Shadow Foreign Secretary William Hague and frontbench colleagues joined senior Liberal Democrats for 6.5 hours of intensive discussions.
David Cameron came to power in highly unusual circumstances. There hadn't been a hung parliament in the UK since 1974, and there hadn't been a coalition since the war. Britain was entering an uncharted era of politics, with many predicting that coalition government would prove weak and unstable, and that the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition wouldn't last a full 5 years.
In terms of the future, our country has a hung parliament where no party has an overall majority, and we have some deep and pressing problems. A huge deficit, deep social problems, and a political system in need of reform. For those reasons, I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats.
David Cameron speaking there outside number 10 Downing Street and explaining that he is intending to form a government which is a proper and full coalition to provide strong and stable government, and that Nick Clegg and he are putting aside their differences. Kissing his wife, the affection, as Nick Robinson was saying, always apparent. And he goes in as Prime Minister for the first time to number 10.
David Cameron inherited a country still recovering from the financial crisis of 2008, with debt rising and with a budget deficit of 11% of GDP. There was considerable political consensus amongst the political parties in the 2010 election that whomever won the election would have to increase taxes and make spending cuts to bring the deficit down. However, many economists argued that, whilst this might be necessary for day-to-day spending, with interest rates low and the economy still recovering, there was space for the government to spend on long-term investment projects, something that Cameron's government failed to do and which must therefore be seen as a failure of his government, especially when you consider that delaying necessary investment often increases the size of the investment needed in the future, making some of the supposed savings during austerity a false economy.
Budget day and all the usual ritual. But it's not just another budget. Just look at those grim faces.
Chancellor, how much is it going to hurt?
The answer is it's going to hurt a lot. No wonder no one was smiling. Jobs lost, pay cut, benefits squeezed, a budget of pain to pay down the deficit.
This budget is needed to deal with our country's debts. This budget is needed to give confidence to our economy. This is the unavoidable budget.
Flanked by his Lib Dem allies, the Chancellor set out spending cuts and tax rises worth £40 billion.
The Lib Dems leaders have sacrificed everything they ever stood for to ride in ministerial cars and to ride on the coattails of the Tory government.
The strategy of the Chancellor George Osborne was to press ahead with the cuts as quickly as possible, but he was forced to slow down the speed and scale of the cuts as the UK economy threatened to enter a double-dip recession. In the end, the Conservative Party would go into the 2015 election arguing that they had half the size of the budget deficit. But at what price? The cuts to the welfare budget and to unprotected departments were severe and would store up significant problems for the future as the cost of underinvestment became apparent. Whether austerity was necessary is a point of considerable political controversy. I would argue that there was an alternative, as demonstrated by how previous deficits have been dealt with. For example, the Attlee government inherited a situation after World War II that John Maynard Keynes described as a financial Dunkirk. but that government was able to create the National Health Service, nationalised 20% of the economy, and built the modern welfare state, alongside a massive programme of council house building and much else besides. Having said this, the narrative of austerity was exceptionally strong in 2010, with no mainstream party pushing for an alternative, so it wasn't simply a failure of the Cameron ministry, it was a failure of the whole political and media system, with the cost borne ultimately by the poorest in our society.
The first British cruise missiles were fired from HMS Triumph at 7 p.m. Subsequently, RAF Tornadoes were deployed in several missions. This marked the beginning of our involvement in an international operation, working with the US and others at the request of Arab nations to enforce the will of the United Nations. In line with UN Resolution 1973, there were two aims to these strikes. The first was to suppress the Libyan air defences and make possible the safe enforcement of a no-fly zone. The second was to protect civilians from attack by the Gaddafi regime. Good progress has been made on both fronts. I can announce to the House today that coalition forces have largely neutralised Libyan air defences and that as a result, a no-fly zone has effectively been put in place over Libya. It is also clear that coalition forces have helped to avert what could have been a bloody massacre in Benghazi. In my view, they did so just in the nick of time.
One of the first foreign policy tests facing Cameron was what to do about the civil war that had broken out in Libya. Cameron pushed for intervention to prevent civilian casualties, and on the 19th of March 2011, with the backing of a UN resolution, Britain and the United States intervened in the conflict. Their initial policy was to protect lives, but this quickly morphed into a policy of regime change. Unfortunately, without proper support for new political structures to emerge, the country collapsed into civil war, and Islamist elements were allowed to create a foothold in North Africa. Libya was a mess, and Cameron must bear a lot of responsibility for this significant foreign policy failure.
The next Conservative manifesto, in 2015, will ask for a mandate from the British people for a Conservative government to negotiate a new settlement with our European partners in the next Parliament. It will be a relationship with the single market at its heart. And when we have negotiated that new settlement, we will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice: to stay in the European Union on these new terms or to come out altogether. It will be an in-out referendum.
By early 2013, Cameron was under considerable pressure from the right of his party to call for a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU, especially given the fact that Labour had a strong lead in the polls and the UK Independence Party was eating into the Conservative Party's support by challenging them from the right. Given that his party were behind in the polls at this point, and the Conservatives had only won power in 2010 by going into coalition with the Liberal Democrats, many have argued that Cameron didn't expect they would have to go through with the referendum, as he wasn't expecting to win a majority at the next election. Furthermore, you could easily see this pledge being dropped if the Conservatives entered into coalition talks with the Liberal Democrats. Now, it's worth saying that Cameron denies that this was his strategy. Whatever the truth of the matter, it was a gamble that didn't pay off, illustrating one of Cameron's flaws as a Prime Minister. He was willing to take big risks with the country's future for ostensibly political reasons, to see off an electoral threat to the party's right and to deal with internal Conservative Party divisions.
The ayes to the right, 400. The noes to the left, 175.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Following the Commons vote, Britain is now in the vanguard of equality. But David Cameron's desire to modernise the country has split his party. More Tory MPs voted against the bill than for it.
The same-sex marriage vote divided the Conservative Party, with 136 Conservative MPs voting against the measure, which meant that it would not have passed without the support of opposition parties. This should be seen as a big success of the Cameron administration, but the fact that the party was so divided highlights the fact that Cameron's modernisation of the Conservative Party was limited, and Cameron did not take his party with him.
Let's take you into the House of Parliament. Live pictures for you. This is what we've been waiting for all day. They've actually voted, many of them, on whether the principle of intervention is something that they support. It's something that David Cameron's been pushing. It is a watered down version of what he's been pushing. He did want intervention per se on this vote. Let's have a look at the sound. We can hear it going through now. Here's
the ayes to the right, 272. The noes to the left, 285.
In August 2013, Cameron's government was defeated in the House of Commons over taking military action in Syria. When a government commands a majority in the House of Commons, defeats are rare. But this vote was truly historic, as no British government had ever been prevented from taking military action by Parliament up until this point, and no government had been defeated on a military matter since Lord North's government was defeated over continuing to take military action in the US War of Independence in 1782. In terms of assessing Cameron's premiership, the vote wasn't that significant, but it is worth highlighting in this video, as Cameron's defeat in relation to Syria strengthened the emerging consensus that Parliament should be consulted over taking military action and that its votes on these matters should be respected by the government.
Good morning. The people of Scotland have spoken, and it is a clear result. They have kept our country of 4 nations together. And like millions of other people, I am delighted. As I said during the campaign, it would have broken my heart to see our United Kingdom come to an end. And I know that that sentiment was shared by people not just across our country, but also around the world, because of what we've achieved together in the past and what we can do together in the future.
The 2014 Scottish independence referendum delivered a no vote, keeping Scotland in the United Kingdom, but it was a close-run thing, with polls narrowing towards the end of the campaign. This led the leaders of the main 3 parties to issue a joint pledge to devolve more powers to Scotland in the event of a no vote, a last-gasp push to ensure that the electorate voted no. The referendum was notable for producing the highest turnout in the UK since universal suffrage, at 84.6%, demonstrating the significance of the issue for the Scottish electorate. It was also notable for the seriousness of the debate, perhaps highlighting a sharp contrast with the Brexit referendum that was to come. For Cameron, the result was a big success that was to settle the question of Scotland's position in the Union for a generation. And that might have been the case, except for the fact that the EU referendum was to pull Scotland out of the EU against its will, leading swiftly to calls for a second referendum.
I've just had an audience with Her Majesty the Queen following the dissolution of Parliament. The general election will be held on May the 7th. And until that day, I will be going to all 4 corners of all 4 nations of our United Kingdom with one clear message. Together, we are turning our country around.
David Cameron went into the 2015 election campaign with Labour just ahead in the polls, having been ahead for most of the past 5 years. With polls so close between the 2 big parties, most pollsters predicted a hung Parliament. This led Cameron to warn of the dangers of electing a coalition of chaos under Ed Miliband that would lead to Alex Salmond playing puppet master.
In just a little time now, you can decide who's going to run the country for the next 5 years. Over the past 5 years, the Conservatives have taken an economy that Labour left in ruins and started to mend it. Thanks to the British people's hard work, we now have an economy where every day there are 500 more businesses. 1,000 jobs are created, where there are more people in work than ever before. Wages are rising faster than prices, and last year, ours was Europe's fastest growing major economy. Now, on Thursday, you can vote for all this to continue, or on Friday morning, wake up to Ed Miliband propped up by the SNP and find this. It's working. Don't let them wreck it.
The Labour campaign in 2015 was still constrained by the logic of austerity. Although Miliband offered some left-wing policies to differentiate his party from the Conservatives, such as a ban on 0 hours contracts and a mansion tax, the overall message got lost, as is epitomised by the vague promises carved into the side of the so-called Ed Stone.
So we better get started. First, with our exit poll, which even now I can't reveal until Big Ben strikes 10. Remember, this is an exit poll, very carefully calculated, not necessarily on the nail. But here it is, 10 o'clock. And we are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
In the end, Cameron won an unexpected victory, caused in large part by the fact that the Liberal Democrat vote collapsed, which helped the Conservatives to pick up seats in Lib Dem Tory marginals, giving Cameron a slender majority of just 10 seats. This majority meant that Cameron would have to go ahead with his pledge to renegotiate Britain's position within the EU before putting it to a vote in an in-out referendum.
We've now reached the point where Sky News is in a position to call this election, and Sky News is projecting that the UK has voted out. The UK electorate has taken the historic decision to withdraw from the European Union after more than 40 years of membership.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected. I held nothing back. I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. And I made clear the referendum was about this and this alone, not the future of any single politician, including myself. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
Cameron's decision to call the referendum was a gamble too far, and Britain voted to leave the EU, leading to his resignation as party leader and then Prime Minister. This would set in train 3 years of chaos and instability as the Conservative Party, Parliament and the country wrestled with the vexing question of how to leave the EU, with Britain ultimately leaving the EU in 2019 under Boris Johnson's deal, which entailed leaving both the single market and the customs union in a so-called hard Brexit. Cameron's premiership is dominated by two issues, Brexit and austerity, neither of which cast him in a good light in my view. Austerity, in delaying or cancelling altogether needed investment, led to many of the problems now facing Britain, whether this is NHS waiting lists, court backlogs, or crumbling school buildings, to name but a few. And Brexit, whatever other benefits people might argue for, was to damage Britain's economic and political standing in the world, and wouldn't even lead to a fall in net migration, with recent figures showing record levels of net migration into the UK. As a consequence of this assessment, my view is that Cameron should be judged near the bottom of any list of post-war prime ministers, but I'm sure some of you will disagree. Well, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video, which is part of a series of videos on post-war prime ministers. If you liked the video, please do like and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye for now, and best wishes.